round habit. In this training, we're going to prune a plant with a round habit. To do that, we've selected this winged euonymus south of the Taylor Building at BYU. At a glance, you'll notice that this particular winged euonymus is in pretty decent shape. It's retained its natural habit, it's been pretty well maintained over the years using natural target pruning, and we're not really seeing any dead, damaged, or diseased material. You'll notice that there are a couple of heading cuts here that need to be repaired, but again, this plant is in pretty decent shape. Probably the biggest issue this plant has is a boundary issue. As you can see here, the plant is growing several inches over the sidewalk. We've also got some issues with window clearance. Normally we wouldn't be concerned about the height of this plant as it pertains to window clearance, because this plant is not planted in front of a window. However, there are other winged euonymus along the south side of this building, as shown here. And at BYU, the preference has been to maintain plants at the same height when those plants are members of the same species and are planted in the same row, or when those plants are planted in close proximity to each other. On a related note, we have some concerns about the genetic predisposition of this plant. According to Monrovia's website, this particular species of euonymus is estimated to reach a height of 6 to 8 feet and a spread of 8 to 10 feet at maturity. As you can see here, the distance from the ground to the bottom of the window pane is 3 feet 6 inches, and the distance from the center of the plant to the sidewalk is 2 feet 3 inches. That said, if this euonymus were to grow as big as it's expected to grow, we would expect to have clearance issues with the window, the sidewalk, and other plants within 5 to 10 years. And that said, chances are we will likely continue to struggle against the genetic growth rate of this plant and the hard boundaries for some time. We also have some spacing concerns as it relates to the spacing between species. Oregon grape is an invasive species, and it has begun to encroach on the space the winged euonymus was intended to occupy. Now, in order to make this video, we've pruned back the Oregon grape to help distinguish this plant from its surroundings, but note that the plants were overlapping before we prepped for this video training. And like we talked about in the general training segment, this is one of those instances where a low-spreading, short-term filler plant is subordinated and pruned back to make room for the maturing plant that is intended to occupy that space in the long term. And so what do we do about this kind of a situation? At this point, we'll pass on that kind of information to our landscape architect and our tree and shrub installation crew. And in the meantime, we'll do the best we can with the design we've got. Well, that's plenty of information in the way of goals and special considerations to get us started. That said, to prune this plant, we're going to do a few things. We'll reduce the size to help clear the sidewalk and create some space between the plant and the wall. We'll thin out some of the older, larger stems to help with rejuvenation. And we'll do what we can to try and clean up some of these heading cuts by pruning these stems back to strong laterals. To do that, we're going to get out a reciprocal saw and remove some of our larger stems first. We'll begin by removing this stem back to this strong lateral here. You'll notice that about halfway through this cut, the stem begins to pinch the saw blade and the two begin to smoke, which is bad for both the saw and the plant. So we'll just bend this stem a bit to relieve some of that pressure. And unfortunately, right as we finish our cut, that pressure is released, the blade lurches forward a bit, and we end up accidentally scuffing a few of the stems behind this stem. And so we'll have to be more careful about that kind of thing in the future. Even so, here's the finished cut. And here's the result. We'll continue to thin by removing this stem here. And here's the result. Lots more thinning to do, and so we'll remove this stem here. And once again, you'll notice scuff marks from our first cut. And here's the result. We'll continue to thin by making reduction cuts here and here. And here's the result. These two stems here and here are codominant, and so we can choose to thin out either stem. To help distribute the spacing of the plant's branches a little more evenly, we'll use our loppers and thin out this stem here. And here's the result. We'll continue to thin by removing this stem here. And here's the result. These next 4 cuts all involve codominant stems, so again we have a variety of appropriate options we could choose from. And again, for artistic purposes and to help distribute the spacing of this plant's branches a little more evenly, we'll use our hand clippers and prune these stems here, 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 and here. And here's the result. We'll continue to thin by reducing these stems here, and here, and here's the result. This next cut involves a trio of codominant stems, which is not uncommon for this species. So we'll prune out this stem here, and here's the result. We'll continue to thin by reducing these stems here, and here, and here's the result. We'll remove this stem here, and here's the result. Again, this next cut involves another trio of codominant stems, so we'll prune out this stem here, and here's the result. This stem here is a little low to the ground and creates a slight imbalance, and so we'll use our saw to make a removal cut here, and here's the result. These next 5 cuts all involve codominant stems. Again, a variety of appropriate options, but for spacing purposes, we'll use our hand clippers and prune these stems here, 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 and here. And here's the result. We'll thin out these codominant stems here, and here, and here's the result. And I think that's a good place to stop. In conclusion, we'll recap what we did. To review, you'll remember that when we first got started, we inherited some heading cuts that had been used to take some stems off the sidewalk. We had some spacing concerns where some of this plant's stems had begun to overlap a bit with some of the stems of its neighboring plants, and the plant needed some thinning. To help mitigate these issues, we cleaned up the heading cuts we inherited by pruning them back to strong laterals, or when that wasn't advisable, we pruned them back to within 1/4 of an inch above a node. And we made about 28 thinning cuts. This is the end of the round habit segment of our training video. Again, we realize that pruning is a combination of art and science. And in many instances, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong way to prune as it pertains to how aggressively to prune and which specific stems to remove. But we hope that this training will give you a better idea of how we prune plants with a round habit at BYU.